Hey everybody, this is obviously Ms. Langella here. We're going to go over Unit 8 of the AP curriculum. The biggest thing to know about this is that we're talking about 1945 to 1980. This is the Cold War. And obviously, building on from last time, we just finished off with World War II. And when you think about the war, the impact that it has on America is major, right? You think about what Americans were going through up to that point, and we were just getting out of the Great Depression. And the war is just essentially was the end of that Great Depression. And when we come out of this situation, we have a lot of money saved. But people, this is shown based on statistics and facts that most citizens at this point had so much money saved that now they're willing to spend it. And it only helps when we have concepts like the GI Bill, which helped veterans basically get jobs and go to colleges to help them find better jobs in the future, as well as help them gain loans for housing. And basically, because of this war and the return home from all these veterans and groups of people, we see the emergence of the baby boom period, which is going to be where people are getting married at a younger age, having children at a younger age, which means populations will grow and get bigger. And obviously that means we see a transition from moving from the living in the cities, now moving to the suburbs, which is outside the cities. And even migration across the entire country when we start seeing the Sun Belt, which is the migration to the Sun Belt, which if you don't know, essentially is the middle, the lower middle areas of the country, from spanning from California all the way to Florida, or South Carolina, mainly because the areas are warmer, a lot more lesser taxes to pay, and it's just less populated. So it means there's more opportunity to live and have jobs and all that stuff. So basically, all those things happening, we also start to see kind of the expansion of, or really trying to attempt growth at businesses when we see the Taft-Hartley Act, which was passed by a Republican-controlled Congress at the time. This was basically the attempt at giving more power to the businesses over unions. And a lot of people are still questioning whether or not why this was even the case. And kind of in response to this, Truman tries to get through what they call the Fair Deal. Basically, it was a reemergence of a lot of New Deal policies, but this was kind of put down in Congress mainly because they controlled the majority at this point. So even if he tried to create new reforms to help people kind of get back from that war and really get back into the workplace, it didn't really work overall. Now, what's important is to just keep this as a reminder. This is now the transition, the difference between the classical Republican Party that we saw with Lincoln versus this new Republican Party, which is focused on conservatism. And we'll talk more about what that means, especially when certain presidents like Eisenhower will kind of emphasize this rise of conservatism. But Truman is the president at this point. He's a Democratic president. And now we have to kind of analyze Truman as a kind of the president against the Soviets in this early Cold War period, mainly focusing on his foreign policy decision making. So perfect example, but the biggest thing he focuses on early on is his containment policy. The idea is you want to contain communism as much as possible and stop it from spreading to multiple places. We have a whole activity focusing on different examples of this. Think about the Marshall Plan, which invested $12 billion into Western Europe to prevent them from falling to communism. The Berlin Airlift. Think about the creation of the CIA and other departments of defense and other joint chiefs of staff, different parts of the military to help with combating against the rise of the Soviets and communism, and even creating alliances like NATO, which is obviously going to be extremely important through multiple different nations in Europe, United States, and Canada, which will be used to combat against a possible rise of communism. The Soviets would also respond as well, creating the Warsaw Pact, and this would obviously set the stage for what we see the rest of the remaining years of the Cold War and really what happens from that. Now, overall, the impact that we see from containment is obviously different interactions with nations all across the world and how we would support some of them against this possible rise of communism. In Japan, we become the full politically, militarily controlled area. As in we basically are their influencers. We tell them to only focus on building an economy while we are trying to basically using us as their defense force. The Philippines gains full independence for themselves, but they are allied with us to help us kind of use as a naval base to really go around the Pacific Ocean. But the biggest loss we have in this early period of the Cold War was the loss of China to the Soviet to really communism as a whole. Well, we had supported the nationalists, which eventually will result in taking control over Taiwan. And obviously the communists led by Mao Zedong will obviously lead to a whole new era of communism, especially with the biggest issue of them all, an alliance between them and the Soviets, which happens in 1950, which is a big deal because China obviously has a lot of influence and size and the power that they have will be seen for many years to come. Now, the first real issue or really boots on the ground conflict that we have is with Korea. And the Korean War basically was a stalemate, but it showed you how basically that South Korea was supported by us and North Korea was supported by the Chinese. And basically, this battle between us two basically showed how this battle over communism would not end. Right, it was going to be in the 50s, and it's only going to get worse from here, especially with examples of like Vietnam. Now, on the home front, there's also going to be a lot of different impacts, mainly with the kind of second rise of the Red Scare. Different espionage cases are going to rise where there's a possible spy ring that emerges in the United States. A lot of hysteria is growing during this time. People thought that State Department officials were part of a communist spy ring, which was not found to be a spy. But then there actually were people that were caught being Soviet spies as citizens, and they were essentially arrested and investigated. And because of this mass hysteria, we see politicians use this as a means to possibly gain new campaign support or re-elections. And one of the key people here is Joseph McCarthy. McCarthy basically was running for House elections, and he basically was using the entire Red Scare to possibly go after opponents in the political sphere, and was using these, using the concepts of like the Un-American Committee, which was made to investigate these policies as a means to get people so scared that they would basically investigate an entire witch hunt on live television. And basically what we found was all the information that he was compiling was falsified. It was fake evidence. He was making more of a show of this whole thing rather than actually investigating anything. And overall, when you think of the legacy of Truman, you really have to evaluate him based on his early containment policy. Most people say that it was relatively effective. It did prevent a lot of the nations at first from going to communism. He did fail with China, but overall, I think you got to give him some support there. Granted, I think some of the issues that he does face would be like Korea, really how close South Korea was at pushing communism out, but we didn't get to finish the job because of China supporting North Korea overall. But overall, Truman did a solid job. Now, in the next president or next era, think about Eisenhower. Eisenhower basically controls the presidency or wins the campaign mainly because of his use of advertising, which we showed in class. The Ike for President video is still ringing through my ears. But when you think of Eisenhower, he's a new wave of conservatism. The kind of key phrase to think about with him is conservatism when it comes to money, but liberal when it comes to human beings. Because when you think about his policies, a lot of it has to do with cutting the federal budget and increasing states' rights. But he also increases spending for basic concepts like Social Security and just general mindsets about helping ordinary people have some backbone or some help just in case something bad happens. So he is a very interesting character when it comes to how much he is willing to spend, but it depends on the certain types of spending he wants to do. Now, with the rise of TV and the radio, we start to see that more people getting access or seeing culture being expanded, whether it's commercials for consumer goods or the rise of rock and roll. A lot of things were changing in the United States at this point, and a lot of people started to really question the social norms that were being proposed on the daily life. And this group of people that started to do this on a daily basis is known as the beatniks. Think about different literature, things like The Catcher in the Rye book, which was basically trying to call people phonies all the time because of how, I guess you would say, in the norm that they were. And this was just a book kind of challenging that concept of being the norm rather than just being yourself. And obviously, these writers would end up kind of setting the stage or foundations for this youth movement that will rise in the 60s. But it is important just to keep them in mind. Now, when it comes to Eisenhower's foreign policy, we have to think about obviously his whole Dulles diplomacy, which basically was him being critical of containment. He wants to use concepts like brinkmanship, which is the idea of using more of the nuclear power as a means to kind of end these conflicts and really limit these entire interactions as a whole. But one of the biggest things that will emphasize his foreign policy decision making is the idea or concepts of the domino theory, right? The idea is if one nation falls, then the rest will follow. And you'll see this evidently with a lot of examples like Vietnam. We'll see that with the origin of Vietnam. We'll see this also happen with the Middle East with the concepts of OPEC, where Iran was basically, we had kind of put in a leader that would basically be seen as a tyrant in that entire area. And basically because of their distaste for us, when they formed their own coalition of oil and petroleum energy, they basically would would kind of isolate us out of the entire group, and the prices for our oil will kind of skyrocket. We also kind of see incidents with the Soviets with the U-2 drone incident, which kind of was pretty embarrassing overall. And even the Cuban Revolution overthrowing of Batista was kind of a bad look for us too, because we tried to really support autocrats that really were not good for the people there. And this was just showing how we were not really making the best decision making early on in this Cold War period under Eisenhower. Now, some things that do occur, especially domestically in this time period, think about the early civil rights movement that happens in the 50s. And one of the biggest things that really creates this change is the Brown v. Board of Ed, which reverses Plessy versus Ferguson, which is a pretty big deal. Obviously, what this does is it kind of challenges the idea that separate facilities are, a whole separate but equal policy. So it basically breaks that down and says that they are not going to be equal. They are this whole concept is unconstitutional. And what this does also is it kind of the second part of it, I mentioned it here, is they say that school segregation specifically shall end with deliberate speed, because the whole background of the case was that Brown was the daughter was a student that was having to travel to summer school because of the fact the school that was locally to her was an all-white school. She was basically forced to go walk like roughly 2 miles to school every morning. Or I think it was even more than that. So it was like close, I think 5 miles that she would have to walk, and it was dangerous. It was unfair. And obviously this was brought to the Supreme Court saying that this should not be allowed. When the Supreme Court rules in favor of Brown, obviously this is a big deal. And so when schools now need to be desegregated, one key example of resistance to this was in Arkansas at Little Rock High School, where we see the incident known as Little Rock 9, where basically Eisenhower sent the military to basically help these students get to class. And we saw kind of mass protest emerge because of this. And this is obviously a big deal because it shows you this discontent or these issues that are being brought because of really the desegregation, or really just the issues that the South still had problems with desegregation as a whole. Other examples of the civil rights movement were things like Montgomery bus boycott, where we saw that there was a mass boycotting of the bus systems in Montgomery because of obviously the policies that they had enacted, where certain parts of the bus could only be seated by white Americans. And we see also the rise of people like Martin Luther King Jr., who will grow in popularity and help create change by using civil disobedience. Okay, now overall, thinking about Eisenhower's legacy, you can definitely say some good things about civil rights to a certain degree. I think when it comes to like his military expansions, or really what he was doing with the Cold War, you can definitely give him some credit with concepts of obviously like him trying to at least be more involved, more aggressively involved. But overall, he does have some issues landing on some of the policies that he tries to do because a lot of things get pushed back against him, which is a problem. Now, next thing we'll talk about is Kennedy. And Kennedy, obviously, the first thing we always think about is who his opponent is in the election. And generally, when you think about it, Nixon versus Kennedy, two young people, both seasoned politicians, both were very much liked in the early ages. But the biggest difference between the two was the introduction of TV. Basically, TV was used as a means of the promotion of these of obviously campaigns and debates. And Kennedy just looked overall better because of Nixon had the flu and he just looked out of it. Now, these debates were shown on radio and television. Basically, on radio, a lot of people assumed that Nixon won because of the policy that he said and that he's seen more clearer on his answers, while Kennedy was kind of dancing around the answer, but he just looked better. So people who watched TV said that Kennedy won, and people who listened to radio said that Nixon won. But overall, more people watch TV than radio, so Kennedy won. And when Kennedy wins, his domestic policy is considered to be one of the better things that he accomplishes. He's most known for his Kennedy's Camelot, which is basically his wide-ranging cabinet of members that were really across all different facets of American society, which really opened up the bureaucracy to have a lot more fresher eyes. And they thought that was one of the best and strongest things that he did. But his frontier programs expanded the federal government, becoming more involved, basically kind of setting up what we see later on with the Great Society programs. And his foreign policy decision making can be questionable. I mean, some of the good things, like, for example, creating more commissions and alliances for progress programs and even the Peace Corps were all seen as good things. but he also has some really bad ones too, like the Bay of Pigs invasion and Cuban Missile Crisis were really tough situations. I think Cuban Missile Crisis is not necessarily a bad thing on his part. He does kind of avoid a major nuclear catastrophe, but a lot of people will look at him and say, well, he did have some problems, and that's really when you look at Kennedy's legacy. There are some good and there are some bad, and I think the biggest thing you have to think about when Kennedy, and I kind of mentioned here why a lot of people point to Kennedy as a top level president, is because he sets the foundation for civil rights, and he actually does decent jobs, not necessarily on Vietnam, but decent jobs with the Cuban Missile Crisis and avoiding major issues here. He is criticized for Vietnam and getting more involved in the issue itself, and even like the problems that he has with the Bay of Pigs invasion, but he does have some good, but I generally think that you can definitely make some criticisms as well. And the next person we'll talk about is LBJ. Biggest thing to know about him is his war on poverty, specifically his Great Society programs. I made an entire list of programs listed here, what they do, a long list of things. Generally, his whole concept was it was a kind of reimagining of the New Deal policy under FDR. The biggest ones to keep in mind is like Medicare, Medicaid. These things are extremely important. It's the same perspectives that we saw with the New Deal policies. Liberals said it wasn't enough. Conservatives said it was too much. It was a tax and spend economy, and that wasn't going to last long in this mindset. Now, under LBJ, we also saw a lot of things change, specifically social movements that were happening. I mentioned the Warren Court. There's a lot of different Supreme Court cases that happen that really alter a lot of the basic rights of things that need to be adjusted or fixed. Basically, one of the biggest issues that we saw was the concepts of like how different types of legalized segregation that were put into place. And the civil rights movement under LBJ was going to be kind of a key thing that we have to analyze. In the 60s, many things had changed. A lot of movements were happening. A lot of social steps were being taken into the right direction. Martin Luther King Jr. kind of took the forefront with his civil disobedience. His letters from Birmingham jail were considered to be kind of that outlining of why that this movement should be expanded upon and why his concepts were the right concepts. And a lot of people jumped behind that. We saw the March on Washington. We saw the March on Montgomery, and Bloody Sunday. These were all kind of outlining major things that need to be changed, and they showed the clear-cut problems that the civil liberties are being infringed upon. But we also see expansion of the civil rights movement through groups like the Black Panther movement and the rise of Malcolm X. Now, overall, the assessment that you would make when it comes to the different movements, think about the civil rights movements. There were acts that were passed that were major accomplishments. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 basically made segregation in public facilities, like in schools, illegal. And this meant not just for schools, but all facilities led by the states and federal offices and buildings. This was a major step in the right direction, as well as concepts like the 25th Amendment, which ended the poll tax, which helped allow for African Americans to gain a more effective right to vote. And that was only expanded upon with the Voting Rights Act in 1965, which granted or really banned literacy tests, which was kind of, if you think about it, poll tax and literacy tests were part of those, grandfather clauses and, part of the Jim Crow era South that was so evident, right, during that period of, issues that were arising in the South overall. Now, we also see rise of more social movements too. The rise of the New Left and counterculture movements were major, especially when it comes to challenging the war effort. Think of the counterculture movement as the hippie movement. It was anti-war, anti-authority, anti-social norms. But it was also to see this new youth movement arise that was, kind of showing the more involvement of younger Americans in politics at an earlier age. We also saw the rise of the women's rights movement, which was basically trying to gain more equality in the workplace. Think about the workers' pay and things along those lines. There were some successes and failures from all these movements, so that just keep that in mind. Now, under LBJ, the biggest thing we had to think about foreign policy-wise is Vietnam. Vietnam was a continuation of Eisenhower's policy of domino theory. Fears of Laos and Cambodia falling into communism would basically be the main reason why we were so gung-ho on going into Vietnam. Biggest thing to know is that we were escalating conflict. We were sending more and more soldiers in there on a 5-year basis. And use of the Operation Rolling Thunder was basically sending more and more bomb strikes throughout Vietnam using napalm, using Agent Orange, and these things had massive impact on the people living there. And Vietnam was one of those incidents where it was just you felt like you just couldn't win. It was super difficult to gain a victory in Vietnam because of the fact that Viet Cong were so embedded throughout the entire society. And on top of that, the public started to turn on the United States very quickly. They started seeing this credibility gap that was forming between what the United States government was telling them as well as what the news was telling them. Because remember, Vietnam was the first televised war. We started to see live action of people getting killed, and really that has a lot of impact on people. There was a rise of this war versus anti-war groups, the Hawks versus the Doves. And even just in the year 1968 was one of the most brutal years in U.S. history, especially when it comes to Vietnam and whether or not we should stay in it, right? The Tet Offensive was the first example of a Viet Cong attack on U.S. troops, and it showed it was embarrassing, right? It was just not a good look for us, and people were really getting tired of it. And this happened right at the start of the year. The My Lai massacre was also shown that this was a moment where U.S. soldiers had attacked a nearby village, basically brutalizing, killing, and there's rape, there was death, and it showed you really like this group that basically broke all rules and just it was a war crime. And that was really how horrific this was. And when people had filmed this, and this was on live television, people were angry. People were frustrated. They didn't know what was going on over there. And because of all these different things that happened, Johnson basically says that he's going to slowly remove troops out of Vietnam, but also that he wasn't going to run for re-election, which is obviously a big deal. And even within the same year, with MLK and Robert Kennedy both getting assassinated in a 2-month difference, people were done. They were just done with all this conflict. And so all these protests and everything along those lines, Nixon ends up walking into the presidency and basically trying to say, we are going to get out of Vietnam, a peace with honor, right? We're going to get out of Vietnam in a way where our head can be held high. And this entire process is known as Vietnamization. Remove soldiers at a higher level, and what we need to have a negotiation or a armistice that is made between us and Vietnam, where we walk away with honor. And what Nixon does at an early time with foreign policy does make really him look a lot better. Like specifically, he does a lot of armistices or decreasing of tensions between USSR and China. The SALT agreement, which was a de-escalation of nuclear arms and nuclear arsenal, which was obviously a big deal. And he was getting a lot of brownie points for that. Domestic policy wise, he was kind of trying to give more power back to the states. So he would have block grants, given basically a blank check or a certain amount of money to states to use it however way they wanted to. And a lot of conservatives were happy about this. This was a pretty big change to what we've seen with previous democratically led presidents. So this is following more in the lines of what Eisenhower would want to do. Now, economically, he was also hit with a really tough situation. He gets hit with a recession and inflation at the same time, causing what they call a stagflation. Basically, the only thing, this is a very rare occurrence. It's basically when the economy is basically not growing for a certain amount of time. There is a level of unemployment, as well as inflation naturally happens because of constant government spending and not enough money going back into it. And these issues kind of just happen in a very rare occurrence, but Nixon tries to put some price freezes on goods to keep them at the same price. He tries to, just try to get our currencies at the same level as the rest of Europe, so it's a lot easier to trade. And eventually it does go down, and really we see the rise of conservatism to certain aspects, but he even starts to promote policies that are more in favor with liberalism because of the fact that he wants to gain a win for that re-election campaign. And that's where Roe v. Wade really does step in and is a major case that goes forward here. So make sure you keep that in mind. Now, when it comes to Nixon in his second term, the biggest controversy that he's hit with is Watergate. Obviously, the fact is Watergate basically was Nixon's ability or his use of wiretaps and hiring people to obtain dirt on his opponents. And when eventually he gets caught basically not only knowing about this incident, but actually hiring these people to do these things, he is on impeachment trial. And basically there was a Supreme Court case where Nixon was trying to basically block the finding and use of different recordings that were used in the White House, where he was found to be talking about him, hiring these people. and he was trying to block it, saying that executive privilege was the reason why, that he shouldn't have to give up the tapes. The Supreme Court basically ruled that, yeah, you kind of have to give the tapes. You are not protected by executive privilege. And once he gives the tapes up, the Congress has their smoking gun. He would have been impeached and removed, but he left, and he was eventually pardoned by his vice president, which was Ford. Now, Ford is the next president, but I generally think you're not really going to see much from Ford. A lot of the things that Ford does is very brief, and a lot of it has to do in response to Nixon, but it really was very small. He wanted to stay out of the limelight for for the obvious reasons. So I wouldn't worry too much about Ford. But let's jump to Carter. Now, Carter's biggest accomplishments is kind of mixed. I think his biggest things is the Camp David Accords, basically a kind of a peace or a coalition between Egypt and Israel. Egypt becomes the first Arab nation to recognize Israel, and obviously this is a big deal between peace. He also continues the SALT agreements that were set up through Nixon, and creates a second version of this with the Soviets. Even afterward, they go to to Afghanistan to invade, and we end up supporting Afghanistan, specifically the Mujahideen, in their conflict against the Soviets early on. But the biggest blunder, or really the problem here, is going to be with the Iran hostage crisis. Now, this is a big deal because we basically butcher a attempt at saving the hostages, and they did not respect Carter enough in order, for them to free these hostages. And it shows you that he was relatively not respected amongst foreign powers. Now, domestically, he's dealing with a lot of inflation. He tries to get some policies passed, but eventually a lot of people will turn on him. And basically, this all kind of goes downhill because he makes what they call the malice speech, which was really dumb of him to do. But basically, the speech was saying how the issues of the country are not really being helped because of the fact that that the American people have malice in their hearts. And this is part of the reason why the country is in a really bad spot. And this is really dumb of him to do because it kind of just blamed the American people for the issues happening in the country and abroad. And basically his approval rating plummets to 23%, which is the lowest, I think, since Herbert Hoover. And it's pretty awful. Now, the end result of a lot of his policies or really a lot of the things that he kind of does domestically, was the kind of the social movements that were also growing during this time. Understand that basically that there's a lot of groups that will kind of emerge, and they will kind of fight for rights and equality of different groupings. So the Hispanic Americans with Cesar Chavez, American Indians movement, which is also known as AIM, which was basically trying to gain reservations and more freedoms. Gave Liberation Front and the conservation movement, specifically with environment and nuclear waste. And also we have the rise of conservatism. Okay. Now, basically what we see with the end result of Carter's presidency is that basically people were really tired of seeing constant protest and seeing how he basically was not doing enough to kind of fix the problems that everyone was having, right? And so people saw the constant, protesting and spending and the weakness that we saw in foreign policy, and that leads to this rise of conservatism, which basically is going to result in Ronald Reagan being elected, which is obviously a big deal. And I think that's kind of the key thing that you have to end with on this overall last section of of Unit 8, which basically is going to have Reagan being elected by a landslide victory. And then that's how you get right back into Unit 9. So that's going to be it for the video, everyone. Make sure you go check the practice questions. Make sure you review the content. And Unit 9 will cover the modern era. This will be covered in the projects you all did. So that's going to be for the video. See you next time.